and welcome to Open News. My name is Ceri. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. Thanks for joining us. As you'll work out on the way through, this is another one of our experiments with doing these things, partly some of us here in the office, some of us out there on Zoom as well, and we're trying to see how well these hybrid events can work. We had a few problems last time with people at home hearing people in the room, so keep your ears out for that and let us know if that's working better. We're not short of news this week, are we? So looking forward to the next hour. I think it should be busy. A few things on my mind. One is that some of you would have seen the Times has picked up on a story today, which was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, which is about the origins of COVID. This particular story suggests that 3 people, according to a US intelligence report, 3 staff members at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were hospitalized in November 2019 with flu-like symptoms, or obviously potentially COVID-like symptoms, which would put those hospitalizations at about the time when I think scientists think you would have started to have seen the initial bouts of sickness that would then lead to the global pandemic that we all came to know and love in the spring of the following year. So I'm going to talk, I hope we can pick up on that. It's a story actually that we've been interested in for a while at Tortoise, and we're hoping to get back into in the summer. Oh, sorry, not the summer, in a month or two. We'd also, I think, probably just want to touch on the government's weird handling, slightly incomprehensible handling of the latest phase of sort of lockdown measures, these geographical measures that apply to certain parts of the UK that just seem for some reason that no one can quite fathom to have been sneaked out on Friday night. The BBC story runs and runs, but I'd really like to know whether there's any appetite to talk about it, because I'm conscious of the danger of us just sort of chatting amongst ourselves. So if you think that's interesting, I've got the sort of chat up here. Well, I can see Mehdi Asghari there already saying, can we discuss the BBC Martin Bashir saga too? Let me know if you're interested, because actually, there are a couple of us here who were at the BBC at the time. So be intrigued to know whether you're up for that or not. Let me know. But actually, I want to start this week. So usual rules, you know the rules. Do message me in the chat. Do put your hand up on the screen. Use the raise your hand function, which is in the reactions button. Is that right, Phoebe? Yep, on the reactions button there at the bottom of your screen. So by hook or by crook, let us know that you're interested in jumping in, and we will bring you into the conversation. And if you're interested in something else that I haven't mentioned at all, because there's a ton of other stuff out there, then do just let us know that as well. But I want to start actually with our own story, because we're in the slightly unusual and relatively luxurious position for us this week of having made a bit of a splash with a story of our own this week. So hopefully a number of you would have seen a podcast that we released yesterday, reported by Alexi Mostras with help from Patricia Clark and Sav Greenwood on the reporting side, Katie Gunning and Basher Cummings on the production side, about how we found the majority owner of a pornography website called Pornhub, biggest pornography website in the world, and managed to do, in doing that, managed to do what a lot of other news organisations have tried and failed to do, which was first to properly identify this guy and then to track him down. And if I can bring Alexi in, first of all, I think what I'm hoping to get out of this meeting, partly thanks Alexi from you and from the rest of the team, but also from others on the call, is where we might go next with this. But I guess, Alexi, let's start with the basics, because a lot of people, I hope, will have seen it. Some may not have done. So perhaps you could just start by telling us why you think it's important that we found this guy.
Yeah, thank you, Ceri. So it's actually a subject that we were thinking about. That question was something we were thinking about throughout the roughly 4 weeks that we've been looking at this, because you could make quite a strong argument, at least on the face of it, that this guy, yes, no one knew who he was, where he was, or what he looked like, or anything like that. But he was a private investor albeit a big one, in a private company. And so what kind of, what was the justification, what was the proportionality for us dedicating so much work and effort into trying to find him? And there are two answers, I think, to that question. One is about the influence of the company that he majority owned, and the other is about the controversy that has recently attracted to it. So just taking influence first, MindGeek isn't just any company. It's big. It's got 450 million in yearly revenues. It employs almost 2,000 people, and most importantly, it runs literally some of the world's most popular websites. So Pornhub, whether we want to talk about it or not, is hugely popular, more popular than Netflix, more popular than Spotify. It's got 3 billion users every month. Most of the people on this call, I reckon, will have access to MindGeek website at one time or another. So, its influence over our lives is quite substantial. And yet, despite that, it operates in an incredibly opaque and unaccountable way. So its majority owner is this guy, Bernd Bergmayer. He's unknown. No one's ever seen him publicly. No photo of him publicly exists. Nothing is known about him at all. But not only that, MindGeek spokespeople in the press use fake names, and its corporate structure is kind of dotted around Luxembourg and other secrecy jurisdictions. So it's incredibly difficult to get a handle on, what it does, how much money it makes, and who makes the money, who's invested in it. So, we've got this company that's kind of the same sort of influence as Twitter or another social media platform, and yet without any of the accountability. And so even without the controversy, the owner of that company would be a person of interest. But then you have, some really, really serious allegations of harm being leveled at Pornhub and MindGeek. There was a New York Times piece that was published in December last year by Nick Kristof, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, that found that rape videos and videos of abuse, underage abuse, were quite common in Pornhub. And it really kind of questioned the moderation systems that MindGeek and Pornhub had put in place, and made the accusation essentially that they were monetizing abuse content and had simply just not done enough to prevent its dissemination. And so we spoke to, several victims who told us that their lives were basically ruined because videos of their abuse were placed onto Pornhub, that they tried to get it off Pornhub, and that Pornhub had delayed in taking it down. And so a lot of them wanted to have accountability and to know which MindGeek executives or who were the people behind MindGeek that they could ask about these allegations, that they could find out what they thought about these allegations, what was being done to prevent them happening again. And so, if you take those two quite important but separate factors, influence and controversy, that to us provided a public interest that was sufficient to override this guy's desire for anonymity.
Alexi, thanks. I'll come back to you in a second, but I just want to, because it's fun, just bring in Patricia Clark, if she's there, just to, sorry, Con, I didn't warn you I was going to do that, but if we can find Patricia, I would love to have a little short version, Patricia, if we can, of just how you found Bernd Bergmayer, because it's, it was a clever piece of work.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Zav Greenwood, one of the reporters here, was kind of the mastermind behind this, along with Alexi. But it started with Alexi, didn't it? It started with Alexi finding a picture. Sorry, I've got it all the time and I completely muddled in my head. So first of all, the Global Mail reported a picture of Bergmayer, and it was the first picture that anyone's ever seen of him, and that was in a 2002 reunion of his the Chicago Business School, which is the university he went to do his MBA. And that was all anyone really knew about him and the town that he was from. So based off of that information, Zav and I put together a list of people who might have known him, and went out and contacted a bunch of people, and you can hear some of the interviews in the podcast. And then separately, Alexi did some sort of digging, and actually it turned out that there were quite a few sort of public images of this guy on Facebook and so on, again, addressed in the podcast. And so little by little, the more information we found, the more we kind of teased out potential contacts and went on based on those leads. Is there a particular direction you want me to dig into a bit more, Ceri?
I just thought it was a really smart thing to have done, and I was, conscious that no one else had managed to pull that trick off. So, Patricia, thank you. Alexi, just to come back to you. So, the question I wanted to try to get to was where we should go next on the story. What have you got in mind as ways to follow it up?
We felt like a part of the story had finished, had been completed when we found Bergmair. That was kind of the essential objective. But quite soon after we found him, we kind of had a look at ourselves and worked out that actually it was potentially just the start of the story, because we'd found one man, but we hadn't really understood the economics behind online porn in the kind of the way that we wanted. Like, there's this huge question about what these big companies like MindGeek and other similar free porn companies, what they do with data. They have incredibly sophisticated data gathering operations. They can tell what sexuality you are, what age you are, what your last search history was, how long you watched a video for, all this sort of stuff. And what do they do with that? Do they package it up? Do they sell it? Who do they sell it to? So what do they do with the data is a big open question. If anyone on this call has any idea, then that would be great to hear. And then the other question is, is Bergmair actually the true majority owner of MindGeek? At least one lawyer that we spoke to thinks not. That he was wealthy, but was he that wealthy to amass an ownership stake, a large ownership stake in such a big company? And if he's not the primary owner, then who is? There was this New York hedge fund called Colbeck Capital that we identified as having loaned MindGeek $380 million back in 2011. Where did that money come from? It wasn't the hedge fund's money. They were representing other investors. So which other investors and what's happened to them now? Those are two areas that I think we'll press on with.
Great, Alexi, thank you. Don't go away. I just want to come. I've got this T Saha. Sorry, I don't know your first name or how to how to get that right. But T Saha has been making some interesting points in the chat. Are you there?
Yeah, hi. I'm in the quiet section of my library, so I need to be really quiet. Sorry.
We can hear you beautifully clearly. So I think it was that question of ownership and investment to you, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I literally just listened to the podcast yesterday, and I absolutely loved the reporting. Thank you so much for getting that across to us. And yeah, I was just thinking, because as you ended the podcast on the open note, that the rest of the investors that might be involved in this, you can't really pinpoint them. I feel like there needs to be an association with them and the victims who've suffered due to this, because right now you can just claim to be oblivious and not understand what kind of impact your money is having. So I feel that would definitely be the next step in the reporting. So yeah, that was my take on it.
So if we could make some progress, as Alexi was saying, with the people at Colbeck Capital who put initial big chunk of money in to get things to where they are now, that's something you'd like to know about. Okay, then you better get back to your studies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't want to have you thrown out of the library. Andrew Girdwood as well, I think you're out there, because you were making a bunch of different points really about where this sits alongside some of the other sort of reporting we've done on topics that people might not necessarily think were immediately related. So what was in your mind?
Yes, this sits at a hub of many other previous Tortoise topics. So we've had bullying at school, which is about often about a lack of empathy, and about parents not being aware of what their children are able to do online, and not knowing what their children are doing online, even if you are aware of it. To me, it's about the spread of information, misinformation as well. We've barely even touched the notion of deep fake videos and all this, where you might find yourself on Pornhub even though you've never been recorded because your face has been planted on it. And obviously there's the fake news scenario there. I am aware of blackmail and extortion threats of people. This will happen to you unless you pay. Yes, so the opening question, and I'm conscious I haven't finished the podcast yet, but in the news list there was a question of should we explore the story further, and I think so, because I think it does dig into the how do we cope in the modern world where we're all able to communicate instantly with people. It feels very cultural.
Okay, and Alexi, just to come back to you, thanks, Andrew. How easy or difficult do you think it would be to get deeper into the sort of financial and ownership sides of it?
Well, we thought it would be pretty difficult to track down this guy.
Now we're complacent. Yeah.
No, I do think it'll be difficult. I think that when I was speaking to this lawyer who's bringing a case on behalf of Pornhub victims, he was telling me about, he characterized it as a kind of Epstein-esque world of shadow capital, is how he put it. So, you get the mainstream functioning of capital and investment through very kind of well-known companies like Goldman Sachs and other investment houses. And then like underneath that, there's a kind of more shadowy version of the same system where investors can put hundreds of millions of dollars into companies through much smaller entities and with far less scrutiny. So if that is what has happened here, then I think the presumption is that they don't really want that investment to be publicized. We do have a few leads to go on. I mean, if you look up Colbeck Capital, for instance, you'll see that certain people, certain very wealthy people were involved or close to its foundation and were close to its founders. And I suppose that you'd want to start there with them to see whether you could establish whether they invested any money in MindGeek and what they thought about the current situation.
Yeah, and Alexi, Colbeck Capital, nominally, I presume, a respectable finance house, and made this investment openly. Is that right?
No, I don't think they made it openly.
Okay.
I think that it was reported on Fox Business maybe a year or so afterwards that they had been involved, as had other certain finance houses in New York. I don't think it's necessarily completely unusual for you not to know about a private investment or a series of private investments into a private company. But having said that, it wasn't something that they broadcast. It's something that the media had to reveal. And then Fabian Tillman, who was the owner of MindGeek at that time, its predecessor, the guy that took the benefit of the loans, he then revealed Colbeck's involvement and the size of the loan in 2016.
Okay, all right. Well, you've got a starting point, but I assume you suspect that Colbeck is not likely to be the end of the road, whatever happens. Okay, listen, I think I know enough from the chat already to see that there is an appetite to do something on the BBC, so I'll save a little bit of time for that. And I've got Chris Cook here in the room with me who can jump in on that as well. Yeah, Mehdi, we will get there, don't worry. I'm going to come to Wuhan, the origins of COVID story first, if I may. And I'm going to start with Giles, my colleague Giles Whittell. As I said at the top, this is a story that we've been interested in. We're going to try and get more interested in. We've had a number of conversations just trying to figure out how to go about it. But Giles, I gave a very brief kind of readout on what's happened in the last couple of days that has brought it back onto the sort of front page of the Wall Street Journal and the Times over here. Can you just sort of run us through where we're at from your reading of things?
So I think we may come back to microbiology in the end when discussing what Tortoise does with it. But yeah, this week, yesterday, the Journal carried a piece on these three WIV workers, Wuhan Institute of Virology workers, who got hospitalized in November before the official confirmation of a COVID outbreak in Wuhan with COVID-like symptoms. So that piece is picked up in the Times here today. Today, the Journal has another interesting piece on, and by the way, the Washington Post has a fantastic timeline on the mainstreaming of this story, which, you know, this time last year was thoroughly fringe. But today's piece in the Wall Street Journal is about where respectable science still thinks the virus originally came from. A disused, or this is a strong working hypothesis, a disused copper mine in southwestern China in Yunnan province. And a working hypothesis is that the virus was taken from there to the Institute of Virology. We know it was, and possibly escaped from there. Now, the Sunday Times Insight team reported on this at length last year, but it's a fun story in today's Journal because you get about a third of the way through, and then it says a Wall Street Journal reporter attempted to gain access to the mine by mountain bike and was then detained and questioned for 5 hours before being released. And I went back up to the top, and you could see there are 3 bylines, and one of them is Jeremy Page. I have absolutely no doubt that Jeremy Page was a former Times Moscow reporter, and he then went back to Beijing for the Journal, was the person on the mountain bike. But it's a good thing to have done, and quite gutsy in the circumstances. Anyway, the message is that the Chinese are restricting access not only to the lab in Wuhan, also to the mine, and then just backing up slightly on context. Let's remember. This time last year, as we reported, no respectable scientist was going near this story for fear of being associated with Trump, who was pushing it along with Senator Tom Cotton and others in Congress, because obviously for political reasons, rather than deal with the pandemic in the States, he simply wanted to blame it on China. Since Trump has gone, the story has gone mainstream for a variety of reasons, including the very lamentable sort of briefings given by WHO delegation to the region in February. They'd spent a month there, used only data provided them by their Chinese hosts. And there's a great backstory here about the slightly strange relationship between the EcoHealth Alliance in New York and the scientist, sometimes known as the Batwoman, at the lab. The New Yorker, who's actually a Brit by marriage, Peter Daszak, said several times in this briefing that, well, he parroted the Chinese line that a probable origin of the virus was in frozen food imported into China. That is not a theory that is widely followed. Anyway, subsequently, 3 members of that delegation have sort of resiled from the statement that it gave, saying, we want to make it clear that we do not believe that the lab leak theory is should be ruled out. Fauci, the virus guru, likewise. Tedros, the head of the WHO, and earlier this week, or last perhaps, PolitiFact, sort of one of the chief fact checkers in the American fact-checking universe, has removed its pants on fire verdict, which it had originally attached to the lab leak theory. So it is a theory that has returned to the journalistic mainstream. And just coming back to where I started, and I know it's a point that an aspect of the story, Ceri, that you've been interested in and have been talking to people about. There's some fairly respectable scientific analysis of the genome of the virus itself, which says, according to one former head of the California Institute of Technology, there's a powerful challenge to the idea of a natural origin of the virus, and that's in something that you'll know all about called the furin cleavage site.
Ah, yes, I do. A little bit about it, yeah. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about this is just how susceptible it shows science is to a sort of change in mood, doesn't it? Because, funny, if I was sort of noodling around this story yesterday and this morning and looking back over some previous events and seminars that had been held about it, and I came across one that the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. held back on the 12th of March. And this fact about the American intelligence report revealing that, or claiming that, 3 workers from the Wuhan Institute had been hospitalized in November 2019, that fact was there in the March the 12th briefing at the Hudson Institute. And you start to think so much of this actually is sort of hiding in plain sight, that what's bringing it out into the open is not so much new facts, as in that case, but actually just science getting over its embarrassment at worrying about being sort of lumped in with Donald Trump. And that does seem to be the critical sort of unblocking of the whole thing, doesn't it, Giles?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, this was the thrust of a piece for which I make no great claims, but I wrote last year. My main source was not a scientist, but she's a lecturer in science communication or something at King's College London, and she was the one who made the point that just because it was embarrassing to be on the same side of an argument as Trump was not a reason to rule it out. We should be clear that there is still no hard evidence for a lab leak theory. But in the same breath, we have to be clear that despite all the work done and despite all the pressure put on the Chinese government, nor is there any hard evidence leading you to a purely zoonotic spillover in the natural world from the animal world to humans. I'm not a scientist. I don't know whether with full freedom to investigate that, you would have expected by now to have found the location and the time of that spillover event.
I think what you would have expected to find, I mean, as you said, I've talked to a few people about this, what you would have expected to find is a pool of virus in the animal species that you thought the virus might have come from. And the fact is, I think there's no pool, there's no reservoir of COVID in any plausible animal candidate that would have hosted the disease before it made the leap to the humans. I think and the only explanation the people who believe in that, as you say, that zoonotic theory have, is that it just got very, very lucky. That's the best explanation they've got. Chris,
Can't hear you, Chris.
Pardon?
Can't hear you.
Oh. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's much better.
Okay. One of the things that this narrative relies on is the time scale as well. So them getting in November presupposes that this is the sort of beginning of the outbreak. But actually there's a prospect that we have the timeline wrong as well, which is to say that we actually keep quite a lot of blood basically in freezers all over the world for various reasons. And there are scientists who have been doing basically serological testing on old samples to see if they can try and find how long this thing has been in circulation. And at every point they've been doing this, they've been pushing back the timeline. So I spoke to a doctor who says they found a case from someone who never left the country in the UK from December 2019. So that's really early.
Yeah.
So it's possible that actually if you like, the people getting sick in November, if that were COVID, maybe a secondary round. And actually but we didn't have PCR testing running in late November for this, late 2019 for this disease we didn't know was coming. And it's possible that what we'll find as we research more is actually the event started some months previously.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there've been other rumours. There was the rumour about even earlier cases in France. I think in the end fell away, wasn't it? But
I think the people with leukemia are a really important, basically, detective resource because they have basically lots and lots of blood samples that are kept for a very long time.
All right.
So I know that like British doctors have been going through samples to try and work out if they can find cases.
Interesting. Okay. Yelena Sofronevich, I think you were out there. You were saying a couple of interesting things in the chat. I mean, Yelena, if we'd said to you a year and a half ago that we wanted to do this story, would you have thought that it sort of, would your reaction have been that we were siding with the conspiracy theorists in doing that?
Oh, sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Sorry, you caught me while I was doing the washing up. Yeah, I think that's the really difficult part when it comes to reporting this now, is that I think Giles just summarised it perfectly earlier. There's no way of doing it really that doesn't get you as being lumped in as being on side with sort of conspiracy theory. And I think James just concluded in the chat that there's a really fine line you have to toe in that. And I think it'd be really interesting to see what Tortoise would make of it, to do something that's slightly longer. I know that there was the kind of 7-minute podcast a little while ago, but I think it's definitely something that could be unpacked in a lot more depth.
And just observing things from a distance, Yele, because I think one of the things that confused matters was that I think the Trump administration was almost trying to give the impression that the Chinese had done this deliberately, that there was a sort of lab theory, but also that there was a sort of theory that this had been done somehow on purpose. Was that something you picked up just sort of atmospherically, that there might have been a deliberate sort of piece of germ warfare?
Well, that's the thing. I think that because coverage of this was originally colonized, if you will, by Trump and by the far right and by that conspiracy element, I think that is the dominant narrative. But that's not to say that I buy into that, but I think that that's, again, like a point on journalism, that we need to ensure that it's covered more objectively, perhaps, but I don't think you can say objectively. It's more just from a scientific perspective. I'd like to see that element of it covered in more detail.
Yeah, okay. I want to come to Thomas Fabry in a second, but Dave Olson, you're unsure about the point that Chris was making about it having arisen earlier. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the experience that we had in autumn of 2020, and then with the new variant, which is obviously a bit different, in December, it didn't take very long. It took maybe like a couple of months to go from next to no cases to a large peak of the virus. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the virus to have been here, everyone to have been acting normally, like being in contact with people, and it to have taken maybe 5 or 6 months to then get into the peak that we saw in March 2020.
Yeah. Chris, how do you square sort of exponential growth with the pattern that we've?
So that's sort of the basic reasoning for why we've come up with the timeline that we have. That you sort of draw the curve back, and it must have, hit zero at some point, basically. Yeah. And the argument back would be that when you're looking for, that can be basically right, but when you're looking for the sort of route, the zoonotic route, or the sort of the lab leak route, whatever, like this moment when it transfers into humans, it's possible this happens with someone quite weird, they travel around a bit, that they, if they find it in leukemia patients, these are people who are not talking to lots of other people, they're susceptible and have a compromised immune systems, but they're not traveling. It's possible that it's just, it exists in a small number of humans somewhere on the globe at some point before. And that doesn't really matter if you're tracking the pandemic, but it does matter if you're trying to work out what the moment when it first crosses over, which is kind of what we're looking for with this. So I agree, it seems implausible. I think you have to assume that it starts when we think it starts, but there is a little bit of evidence that it may be actually a little bit older than we think it is, in which case, if these people got sick in November, they may be effectively secondary cases, not the transfer cases. That's the sort of issue. Doesn't need, if it's only like a month older than we think it is, then again, these cases may be incidental rather than important.
Okay, Thomas Fabry, if you're there, you made an interesting point about social media platforms as you said, aggressively censoring lab leak stories. What did you see there that caught your eye?
Hi. Well, I think it's a complicated one from media for social media, because another example is face masks. So I remember WHO and the BBC in March or April last year having lots of content saying, well, masks don't really work, and the same thing more or less on the lab leak theory, and then later on. So I think there was a New York Post story. I don't know the quality of the story. I'm not really an expert on this. It was kind of banned by Facebook, and now probably if you publish stories that are anti-mask, saying the masks don't work, etc., you might get in trouble for with Facebook on the other side. So it's really I don't have a strong opinion. I mean, it's a difficult, but it's a topic with a very difficult balance between free speech and censorship and public health. So, but as media organization, it gives us thinking that when we're going a bit too full on something with the tone, and then we might risk losing credibility when things might change.
Okay, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You can sort of, it don't often feel a bit Trumpy, but here we are talking about, the genuine possibility that this might have come out of a lab in China, a WHO investigation that seems to have been amazingly poor, and as Thomas was just saying, a sort of, a not concerted but visible move on social media platforms to close down discussion about it, then it's probably about as Trumpy as I felt in a long time. Listen, I think we will keep you across that, because we're going to, we're going to try to return to it, to do a proper story on the origins of COVID sometime in the summer, or maybe September, if we can. I think we know what we're trying to do. It's just we're not really going to get there until I think someone's able to get back into the Wuhan Institute, and that's not an obvious thing. But since there has been a demand, let me turn to the BBC issue that's been out there at large all week, and rather than me trying to sort of jump into it, we've probably all seen what it is. Mehdi Askaria is out there, and it's been sort of banging the drum for us to get into this. So Mehdi, let me come to you first. You said you wanted to make a couple of observations regarding the BBC Martin Bashir story. Why don't you jump in and tell us what they are?
Yes, thanks, Gary. As you said, just a couple of observations. As much as it perhaps concerns Tortoise, I think I understand, because of the good reasons, we've got to be very careful at Tortoise. But at the same time, this is a national issue. It's something that Tortoise cannot ignore or perhaps downplay. I'm not suggesting that it is or is intending to, but we should not, when I say that a lot of us are members here, fee-paying members, a lot of us, and spend a lot of time and energy, quite dedicatedly come to the meetings. We should not adopt the approach of an ostrich. I think we are Tortoise for good reasons, but definitely not an ostrich. And we've got to face, again, one or two individuals being involved in that, and not trying to run an investigation here. But we are dealing with an issue with a national institution that, being the BBC, has been involved in for the last nearly 25 years. And at every turn, it's made a sorrowfully poor decision. It's not only what actually happened with regard to Martin Bashir's 1995 duplicity and trying to get that false bank statement, etc. And one thing perhaps is not being so much highlighted from my perspective is when BBC was approached under the FOI, Freedom of Information, by a journalist, they denied they had enough files to release information, whereas that information was later on provided to Lord Dyson. I mean, this is huge from my perspective. You know, virtually bypassing or refusing a freedom of information request by telling lies, absolute lies, that this information, these files do not exist. The next step is rehiring of Martin Bashir. Okay, now whether transparency, accountability, honestly, were actually exercised, due diligence was exercised. The man that BBC knew was behind all these things was rehired, was later on promoted, and this morning we held the BBC's DJ virtually celebrating the fact that Martin Bashir is gone, but he's still being paid by the BBC. There are so many issues, Ceri, here that is really it's cringing. I just can't believe it. I had the highest respect for the BBC, and I'm just absolutely disillusioned.
And Mehdi, I suppose the BBC always waits for stories that will change the minds of supporters about its role or its behaviour or its ethics. Is this one that's actually fundamentally changed the way you think about it?
At the end of the day, BBC is made up by its components, which are its journalists and its senior managers at every level, and people do make mistakes. But this train of virtually 25 years of evasiveness by mistake upon mistake upon mistake has actually damaged my own personal attachment, if you like, to the BBC and the respect I've had for it.
Okay. Mehdi, thank you. I want to come to Lucy Hoobman, if Lucy's out there, and then Peter Flynn, both saying interesting things in the chat. While we're lining them up, let me just get Chris in, because Chris, both of us were in the BBC in such a long period that this whole saga covers that we were there for some of it. What, if you get your sort of Richter scale out, where do you put this current shenanigans on the sort of Richter scale of BBC scandals?
So it's really high. It's really, really high, and rightly. But the thing that's
and because of the crime or the cover-up, just to go back to sort of Mehdi's distinct both.
So I think the thing that let me give you a brief anecdote, right, about something that happened when I was at the BBC. So one of our picture editors, who's the people that literally make the tapes that go on the TV, was making a film, and they got footage of a maternity ward. And it turns out one of the cameras where they filmed in the maternity ward had its microphone switched off. So they used the sound from they basically were trying to use a picture that had no sound on it. And that's actually a bit discordant when you're watching TV. So they got the sound of the maternity ward from the other tape and put it over the sound. So it's beeping, crying, ward noises.
Yeah.
And what the picture editor was not trying to mislead anyone. They wanted baby noises to go over this picture of babies. And someone worked out that the pictures didn't fit the noise, and they complained. And there was an investigation, and this guy,
a viewer complained.
A viewer worked out that there was a problem, and wrote a letter. And they looked into it, and it turns out that yes, they had mismatched the sound and the audio, the video, which actually happens all the time for lots of reasons. But for whatever reason, this was a big deal, and there was an investigation into it because it contravenes this thing that's drummed into you at the BBC about this idea called trust. And trust at the BBC is sort of standard stuff that Mehdi talks about. It's that idea. I also find like the idea, the BBC is also incredibly thinly resourced at the moment compared to what it was in the in the mid-90s, and I find the idea of being able to go up to a graphic artist and say, I'd like you to commission some forgeries just in your spare time, like that could never happen today. Like there's loads of stuff that is just, I find, totally bizarre and
you'd be told to do your own forgeries these days, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you'd have to sort of, also the BBC graphics are not as good as they used to be, I think, is one of the other things I learned from that. I wouldn't, I'm not sure they could turn out a decent forgery anymore, but they I find that like there are lots of things I find puzzling. So it's quite officious the way it deals with complaints now. So that case which I think was totally harmless bit of picture editing chicanery, the way that was escalated, really officious about complaints. It's also sort of not capable, I don't think, of doing what Bashir did anymore. Like it couldn't be covered up, it couldn't be hidden. You couldn't have, the bureaucracy sort of holds you together. There would have to be an invoice paid to the graphic designer, which had to be signed off by an editor. Like the systems kind of prevent a lot of this stuff now. So it still has lots of problems. And I'm quite critical of the BBC's coverage in lots of ways, but the thing it's got good at is stopping the stuff that Bashir was doing in the mid-90s. That's the thing it's actually really stopped.
Yeah. Lucy Hoopman, are you out there? Hello, good to see you. You were making a really interesting point in the chat about being called in to clean up some BBC messes in the 90s. So tell us as much about that as you can.
Well, they're not as, they're really not as startling as any of this, but there were a few things going on in the 90s. I mean, there was John Burt who came, and then there was the sort of big advent of independent producers, which was becoming quite a big thing. And the BBC, as you know, or as you may not have known on today, but as you may know, was not quick to commission external independent producers, even though they knew, that it was coming. So, for example, I was hired by Paul Heyman because I'd worked in the independent sector producing documentaries for 10 years to help him do it. But maybe he's listening, I shouldn't really say that, but they didn't really want the competition. And in those days you had to, and then I had to set up a commissioning process for Jane Root when she came in, because the BBC had a terrible reputation for reading other people's ideas and then not commissioning them and passing them off as their own. So, that was something that had to be dealt with by a system. And then, there were I'll just tell you one story. I mean, it's anecdotal, but they had, and it doesn't, well, I don't know if it pertains to today, but I mean, they had some very, very successful daytime shows by people that the controllers, let's face it, historically have always been sort of middle to upper class people who need BBC One, but don't make BBC One programmes themselves. They are like BBC Two, they make beautiful documentaries, but it's a universal service. And one of these providers was somebody everybody absolutely loathes, probably for very good reason, who had been an MP, who was into prison reform. I don't really need to name him, but he was quite a sort of oleaginous TV presenter with a big studio show, Robert Kilroy-Silk. And they did something terrible. I mean, they really mucked up. They did a live show. At the time, local authorities had required the setting up of registers of paedophiles. I don't know if you remember this happening, but it was a lot of toing and froing and upcry about this, and there were for and against. So in his wisdom, he decided to do a live show. And he told the live audience that he had a convicted paedophile who'd been in jail in the studio on the stage, and they blobbed him so his identity couldn't be revealed. But it was live, and it turned out that they had some, victims in the audience as well. And because it was live, somebody phoned the police, and the police swooped on the studio and they arrested people, and it was all over the tabloids, for days. And the high up people said, get rid of this man, get rid of Robert Kilroy-Silk, just get rid of him. but the daytime controller really wanted to keep him because it was, you know, box office. So I think the only time they paid for me to fly anywhere, I was sent to Malaga with his commission in my back pocket. I was commissioned, you know, I looked after factual independence, and I had to negotiate with him. And what I had to negotiate was that I would basically train all his researchers, or have them all trained, because he had, you know, claimed he had no money or whatever. And we did a deal. But there were many, many incidents of people posing as fakes, you know, studio audiences full of people who could have been offended, people who were, I don't know what's the word, fantasists who came on to various shows. And, you know, in the end, I think I was being punished actually, because I had to, at one stage, the BBC was biking guest lists of studio audiences to me every night in my flat. And I was somehow supposed to magically vet them and say, well, this one's okay and that one's a fraud. And they only did that because they didn't want the buck to fall with them. And also they weren't shows that people took an interest in. Now, I'm not saying that is the same as forging, you know.
The interesting thing, Lucy, is that, you know, so collectively, maybe that set of experiences gives you a bit of an insight into the culture of a place. And I suppose the question might be whether, having had that insight, you're surprised by the Martin Bashir revelation, or perhaps not surprised by it. Where are you on that sort of spectrum?
I'm not surprised, I think, but what I'm upset by is the cover-up. And I'm particularly furious about the way they started speaking about it in the last week before, you know, Tim Davie went on the radio and did a really good interview this morning. I mean, first of all, they named James as the editor in charge, or, you know, the head of news. And, you know, of course wasn't, you know, this person was the person who was the editor. And then they named Steve Hewlett, who's dead, as the editor of Panorama at the time, who would have been responsible. And I just think this is terrible, terrible behavior. Okay, people have left, and okay, you know, maybe, you know, James did or didn't know something, but that is hardly what you're going to say on national news, is it? You know.
Look, I think, to be fair to James, he put his own hand up to take responsibility as head of news at the time.
Well,
I don't think the BBC dobbed him in. I think he said, look, this one's on me, because I didn't know about it, but I was running the department. So
yeah, but that's a good thing for him to have done, but it may have been necessary for him to do, not because he was told to do it, but because otherwise it might have come out in another way, and it might have been seen to be something that it isn't. So I just it's more, yeah, the cover up, the whistleblower. I mean, Tim Davie said something today about how the whistleblowing is the thing he's, you know, the lack of space for whistleblowers to feel safe is something that he feels very, very strongly about. And people have said this over the years in many organizations. And I, you know, if that could get changed, that would be an outcome. But, you know, I don't think they've dealt with it particularly well. I mean, I think that might be changing now. Okay. I haven't read the report, but yeah.
No. All right, Lucy, thanks so much for that. It's really useful. I'm going to come back to Chris, and then I'm going to come to Peter Flynn in a second. I mean, I'm really struck by Lucy. So when I was at Newsnight, we had the two incidents that stick in my mind, one of which is when we were accused of, used to sit opposite the graphic designers. They were sort of literally, the person opposite me made the things for the back of the studio. Newsnight was accused of making Jeremy Corbyn's hat to look more Russian. Oh, yes, I remember that. Which was a controversy that raged for some days until the Channel 4 did an explanation of the parallax effect to explain how the hat will change in shape if you put it on a curved screen. We also had a guest who was, during one of the general elections, who was a vicar of a sort of some low church, right, of a sort of small Methodist-y denomination of some kind. And there was a whole farrago about whether she counted as, should she be allowed to wear her dog collar and present herself as a vicar, or, you know, as a minister, given that she doesn't represent the Church of England, was literally how sort of where things turned into. Is she a fake vicar that Newsnight has found to give respectability to some perspective? Like the idea, I find sort of Lucy's reflections on those sort of audience choices sort of astounding, because like today, the level of scrutiny you get for every decision at every point is so incredibly high that literally, is this person a vicar of a high enough church was a thing you now have to think about, it turns out.
So I just think things are wildly different to the way they were.
I think, broadly, my experience with the BBC over 25 years was that it got more accountable, more transparent, that all kinds of things that really quite senior people had done in the 90s would have caused them real problems 25 years later. And that's partly, I think, because the institution got better and more accountable, but also, I think, just as you were saying before, it just gets harder to hide stuff. And there was, in the 1980s, 90s, you could be a correspondent in some far-flung part of the world, and the chance of something coming back to haunt you that you might have exaggerated or been a bit loose with was, I think, practically zero.
I mean, one of the on to Mehdi's point and Lucy's point about the rehiring. I was at the BBC in 2016. I think you had just left.
Yeah.
And the only conversation I recall with anyone was, why has Martin Bashir been hired in such a junior job? Like, I've heard of him. He is a person from my childhood who disappeared at some point in the 90s, and he's now taken a post that is junior to me. This is quite weird. That's my only. So I think the sense to which it was totally common knowledge, that is not my reflection. But then again, I was dealing with a group of people of whom I was an older member on Newsnight, and the average producer is about 25, right? I mean, and that is not a conversation that was going on where I was in the institution anyway.
Yeah, okay. Peter Flynn, are you out there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me now, Ceri?
Yeah, very good. Good to see you again. In the chat, anyway, I think you're being a little bit more forgiving of the BBC than perhaps Mehdi was at the start. Am I interpreting you right there?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm quite interested in it from how a large organisation deals with an issue like this. And I've been quite heartened from what I've seen in the chat about people saying we need a bit of perspective here, because the BBC is unique, and it certainly showed itself to be unique in the last few weeks. In no other media organisation would so publicly chastise itself or expose itself to the issue that's gone on. I just couldn't see the print media, if it was them that had, at some point or one of their people made an error. Amal Rajan was being interviewed by Sophie Rayworth on News at 10 as it was breaking and saying, look how badly we've done here with our behaviour. And I struggle to think of other organisations being quite so candid upon themselves. And so then I then worry then that the purpose of the various reviews and government's reviews is not really going to fulfill the aims we'd expect, given that the main instigated act happened over 20 years ago. The rehiring happened in 2016. All of your contributors for the last 5 minutes have been talking about how things have changed, and Chris saying he couldn't perceive it happening now. So the reviews into governance, my worry is that they're either going to continually be a stick to beat the BBC with, and ironically the BBC is going to be complicit in that because it's being so open about what it publishes, or a Trojan horse for yet further politicising of the governments. And Tortoise has covered this recently on one of its stories. So those are my concerns, that the reviews and inquiries are going to be either unable to do their job because the thing has already moved on, the juggernaut's already moved on, or going to be used for another purpose, which is of real concern to me.
Yeah, but I know from contributions you made to previous thinkings that your career has taken you into contact with the royal family at points as well. So you must have some sympathy when the future king of the country stands up and says, the BBC contributed to a chain of events that broke up my parents' marriage, or contributed to that, and in the end led to her death. And you must have some sympathy from that side of things as well.
Yeah, and there's an irony there if you make a parallel, in that so were so many others as well. But the BBC is openly it stuck its head above the parapet in military parlance. But and yes, there were others as well. And you should let's try not to do whataboutery, but the sort of that was over 20 years ago, and it's incredibly tough, and it's incredibly sensitive and deeply meaningful to the Duke of Cambridge. And I would hope that even he recognises that things have changed greatly, and that the BBC is such an important institution, almost hopefully felt by the United Kingdom's public to be an institution that we should retain and protect.
Yeah. I mean, it's a funny one for all of us, because I was on the Today programme in 1996 when the Mail published its first piece, which talked about the bank statement. So it was this is another thing that was sort of hiding in plain sight, that the Mail, some months after the Bashir exclusive, published this thing alleging that it had been got in that way. And I've gone back to a number of people who were there with me at the time, and I don't think we followed it up. And you would have thought, knowing the sort of rivalries and the way the BBC was in that time, that a story in the Mail on Sunday knocking Panorama would have been absolute catnip to the Today programme. But for whatever reason, and definitely not because we were told not to, we didn't chase it down. We didn't follow it up. It might be that we just thought, there's the Daily Mail again knocking the BBC. We might have looked beyond it for that reason. But unraveling all these decisions that go back over 20 years about why, as Chris said, this was, my sort of impression is that this was known, but patchily known within the BBC. That some people knew all about it, some people knew nothing. And
I think my hunch is that the letter from Diana is the core of all of the problems. That is to say that once you know that the person who's got the most to complain about is happy with what happened and isn't going to pursue it, then why are we complaining? Like, if she's happy to have been tricked effectively, then why does this matter? This isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, we're intruding now onto people's lunchtime sandwiches. So let me just thank you all for taking part. I think what I take from it, Mehdi, I take your point about being tortoises but not ostriches. So I think we should be open to doing something about the BBC if we think we've got something. We've got quite a lot of information around, but I'm not sure we know exactly what we want to say yet. We will do the origins of coronavirus, and I think and thanks for the steers on the follow-up to Pornhub, because I think that's another one that we will. I think a lot of news organisations, when they've broken a big story, want to follow it up because it's just a way of keeping ownership. But I think from everything Alexi was saying, there's a ton of leads and angles there that we really will want to get into. So thank you all for steering us in the right direction there too. Okay. Thank you, Lucy. Finally, we will get a whistleblower's charter. All right. Thanks all. See you soon. Bye.